Their hearts raced at 140 beats per minute, while lying still, their legs filled with water. The doctor is only cure, forcing them to swallow the warm, raw hearts of penguins. This is the gruesome price of conquering Antarctica. The sound is the only thing that is real. It is not the silence of the void. It is a grinding, shrieking roar. Imagine a wooden house being chewed by a concrete mouth. That is what the ship sounds like. The hull of the Belgica is groaning under millions of tons of pressure. The massive oak beams are bending inward. Every few minutes, a loud crack echoes through the cabins like a gunshot. You flinch. You wait for the freezing water to rush in. You wait to drown in the dark. Inside the mess hall, the air is thick enough to taste. It smells of wet wool, unwashed bodies, and the copper tang of old blood. A man sits in the corner. He is rocking back and forth. His skin is not white. It is a translucent, sickly green. He is staring at a kerosene lamp that is flickering and dying. He is whispering to a woman who is thousands of miles away. He is begging for the sun. But the sun is dead. It has not risen for weeks. It will not rise for months. In the bunk next to him, the doctor presses 2 fingers against a sailor's wrist. The man is lying perfectly still, yet his heart is racing. It hammers against his ribs at 140 beats per minute. The terror of the ice has infected his blood. His gums are swollen black sponges. His legs are filled with fluid. He is rotting from the inside out. Outside on the deck, the wind howls through the frozen rigging. It sounds like a chorus of weeping ghosts. The temperature is 40 degrees below zero. The cold does not just bite, it burns. It sears the exposed skin and freezes the moisture in your eyes. A sailor looks out over the rail. There is no horizon. There is no line where the earth ends and the sky begins. There is only the crushing, absolute blackness of the polar night. He realizes then that the ship is no longer a vessel. It is a wooden coffin, and the lid has been nailed shut from the outside. Before the darkness descended, there was champagne. Before the madness took hold, there was the blinding flash of magnesium powder from photographers' cameras. The departure of the Belgica from Europe was a carnival of national vanity. It was late 19th century optimism distilled into a single, heavy, steam-powered bark. Belgium, a small country with a large inferiority complex, wanted its name written across the bottom of the world. They wanted new islands, new species, and new glory. They did not know they were sending 19 men into a meat grinder. The commander was Adrien de Gerlache. He was a man of stiff collars and stiffer pride. He had raised the money for this expedition by begging from the government and selling the promise of discovery to the public. He had everything to lose. If he returned home without a significant geographical prize, he would be a laughingstock. This fear of humiliation would prove far deadlier than the cold. By January of 1898, the Belgica had reached the bottom of the world. The summer was already dying. The days were shrinking. A prudent captain would have turned the prow north, escaping the encroaching winter to return the following season. But de Gerlache looked at his charts and saw only failure. He had discovered nothing of note. He could not go back. On the 28th of February, the devil offered him a choice. Ahead of the ship lay the pack ice of the Bellingshausen Sea. To the uninitiated eye, it looked like a chaotic field of white debris, broken by dark veins of open water known as leads. These were the highways through the frozen labyrinth. De Gerlache stood on the bridge. He saw the ice thickening. He saw the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. His officers hesitated. His crew looked nervously at the white wall, but the commander gave the order. Full steam ahead. South. Into the trap. The ship pushed into the loose pack. At first, it seemed easy. The heavy wooden hull shoved aside the floes like a plow moving through slush. They penetrated 90 miles deep into the flow. They were chasing a phantom record, desperate to go further south than anyone before them. Then the weather turned. The Antarctic Ocean is not a passive thing. It is a violent, shifting organism. A gale rose up from the north, screaming across the water. It did not just bring snow. It brought pressure. The wind acted like a giant hand, pushing the loose ice floes together, squeezing the gaps shut. The dark veins of water vanished. The floating islands of ice collided and locked together. From the deck, the crew watched in horror as the ocean disappeared. The liquid sea turned into solid stone before their eyes. The chaotic jigsaw puzzle fused into a single white continent. The Belgica was no longer floating. It was gripped. The ice cemented around the hull, holding it fast. The storm raged for days, packing the ice tighter and tighter. When the wind finally died down, the silence that followed was heavy and absolute. There was no way forward. There was no way back. The men looked over the rail and saw that their world had shrunk to the length of the ship. They were adrift, locked in a moving plate of ice that was drifting aimlessly with the currents. The realization settled over them like a shroud. They were not explorers anymore. They were prisoners. And the warden of this white jail was the sun, which was already beginning to dip lower toward the horizon, preparing to abandon them entirely. On May 17th, 1898, the sun committed a betrayal. The crew stood on the frosted deck and watched the glowing orb dip below the jagged horizon line. The sky turned a bruised purple, then a dull gray, and finally, an absolute, suffocating black. They waited for the dawn, but the dawn did not come. The sun would not rise again for 70 days. The polar night is not simply the absence of light. It is a physical weight. It presses against the eyes. It seeps through the wooden planks of the hull. Inside the ship, time began to dissolve. Without the rhythm of day and night, the concept of a schedule became a joke. Sleep became fragmented. Men wandered the corridors at 3 a.m, their eyes wide and bloodshot, staring at nothing. The lamps burned with a sickly yellow glow that cast long, dancing shadows against the moldy walls. The silence of the trapped ship was broken only by the ticking of clocks that no longer mattered. In this eternal twilight, the human body begins to consume itself. The first victim was Emil Danko. He was the expedition's magnetic observer, a man of science and discipline. But discipline is no shield against biology. His heart, weakened by the early stages of scurvy and the relentless stress of the cold, began to fail. He did not die in a dramatic struggle against a polar bear. He died in his bunk. He withered away. His breath grew shallow. His skin turned the color of old parchment. On June 5th, his heart simply stopped beating. It was a quiet exit from a loud world. The death of Danko shattered the fragile illusion of safety. Until that moment, the men believed they were explorers suffering for glory. Now, They realized they were merely prey. The burial of Emil Danko was a scene of grotesque beauty. They could not dig a grave. The ice surrounding the ship was harder than granite. A pickaxe would only bounce off the surface. Instead, they had to open a door to the abyss. Two sailors took axes and chopped a hole in the frozen sea a few yards from the ship. The ice was thick. It took hours of labor in the freezing dark to break through. When they finally pierced the crust, the black water bubbled up like oil. It was a dark, hungry mouth waiting to be fed. They wrapped Danko in a simple canvas sack. They weighed the bundle down with iron weights, perhaps pieces of the engine or spare anchors, to ensure he would not float. The entire crew gathered on the ice. The temperature was far below freezing. Their breath formed clouds of ice crystals that clung to their beards. There was no priest. There was no choir. There was only the howling wind and the creaking of the ship. Commander de Gerlache spoke a few words, but the wind tore them away before they could be heard. They placed the body on a wooden plank. They tilted it. For a second, the canvas sack hung suspended over the black water. Then it slid. There was a heavy splash. The dark water swallowed him instantly. He did not sink slowly. He vanished. The black liquid rippled for a moment, and then the surface began to freeze again, almost immediately. The hole was closing. The men stood there for a long time, staring at the patch of fresh ice. They were not just mourning a friend. They were looking at their own future. The hole in the ice was small, but it was deep enough to hold them all. As they walked back to the ship, heads down against the gale, they could feel the darkness tightening its grip. The sun was gone. One man was dead, and the winter had only just begun. After the ice swallowed Danko, the ship transformed from a prison into a hospital ward. But this was a hospital with no medicine and no hope. The enemy was no longer just the cold outside. It was the biology inside. Scurvy is not a polite disease. It does not kill you cleanly. It unmasks you. It takes the body apart piece by piece. The first sign was the silence. The men stopped talking because their mouths were rotting. Their gums turned into swollen, black sponges that bled at the slightest touch. Teeth loosened in their sockets, rattling like dice in a cup. But the horror went deeper. Scurvy destroys the connective tissue that holds a human being together. Scars from childhood accidents, wounds that had healed 20 years ago, suddenly tore open. The body was forgetting how to be whole. Legs turned purple and green. Ankles swelled with fluid until they looked like tree trunks. The leadership collapsed. Commander de Gerlache locked himself in his cabin. He was too weak to stand. He spent his days staring at the frost on the ceiling, listening to the groaning of the timber. Beside him, Captain Lecointe was fading. They did not plan their escape. They planned their legacy. With trembling hands, they wrote their last wills and testaments. They accepted that the Belgica would be their tomb. But Dr. Frederick Cook refused to die. The American doctor looked at the dying crew not with pity, but with a cold, clinical determination. He realized that the tinned food from Europe was poison. The preserved meatballs and salted pork were devoid of life. To survive, the men needed fresh blood. They needed the raw essence of the Antarctic. Cook ordered a massacre. He sent the few men who could still walk out onto the ice. They hunted penguins and seals. The snow around the ship became stained with bright red arterial spray. The butchery was messy and desperate. They dragged the carcasses back to the ship, leaving trails of crimson on the white floes. Then came the hardest part. Cook forced the crew to eat. The meat of the penguin is not like chicken. It is dark, fibrous, and oily. It tastes of fish and musk and wild game. Cook ordered it to be served barely cooked. He wanted the nutrients to remain intact. The men gagged. They vomited. They wept. But Cook stood over them like a tyrant. He made them swallow the flesh of the only other living things in this frozen hell. He told them it was medicine. But meat was not enough. They were starving for light. The darkness of the polar night had stripped their nervous systems of energy. Their hearts were racing, but their minds were comatose. Cook devised a therapy that looked like a scene from Dante's Inferno. He ordered the men to strip naked. One by one, the skeleton-thin sailors peeled off their filthy layers of wool and fur. Their ribs pushed against their translucent skin. Their bellies were distended from malnutrition. They looked like walking corpses. Cook marched them to the ship's furnace. He opened the iron door of the boiler. The fire inside roared, casting a violent, flickering red light into the cramped engine room. He made them stand in the glow. He called it the baking cure. Imagine the sight. A dozen naked, green-skinned men standing in a semicircle around an open fire, deep inside a ship trapped in the ice. The heat seared their fronts while the freezing draft from the hatch chilled their backs. They turned slowly, like meat on a spit. The red light danced on their hollow faces. They did not speak. They just stared into the flames, trying to absorb the energy of the fire into their dying bones. It was the madhouse promenade. It was grotesque. It was primal. But as the heat soaked into their skin, for the first time in months, their hearts began to slow down. The animal inside was waking up. The sun returned, but it brought no warmth. It hung low in the sky, a pale, unblinking eye that watched the slow death of the expedition. By January of 1899, the Antarctic summer was at its peak, yet the ice did not yield. The Belgica remained locked in the center of a white continent. The crew looked at the calendar and felt a new kind of terror. They knew the math. If they were trapped for a second winter, there would be no survivors. The coal was gone. The food was gone. Their minds were fractured. They would simply freeze into statues in their bunks. Desperation breeds madness, or perhaps it breeds genius. Dr. Cook and Roald Amund then looked at the charts. The open water was nearly a mile away. Between the ship and the freedom of the sea lay 2,000 yards of solid, pressure-packed ice. It was 7 feet thick. It was hard as concrete. They did not have an icebreaker. They did not have heavy machinery. They had long, two-handed saws. They had explosives. And they had the skeletal muscles of starving men. They decided to cut the ocean in half. The work began in the middle of January. It was the labor of slaves in a frozen mine. The men stood on the ice, wrapping their bleeding hands around the iron handles of the saws. They worked in shifts, up and down, up and down. The sound was a rhythmic, rasping scream of metal against crystal. They sawed through the day. They sawed through the night. They cut triangles of ice, pushed them under the flow, and moved forward, inch by inch, foot by foot. When the saws failed, they used chemistry. They brought out the tonite, a high explosive. They drilled holes into the pressure ridges. The silence of the Antarctic was shattered by violent, thumping detonations. Plumes of black water and shattered ice geysered into the air, staining the pristine snow with the soot of destruction. The men looked like demons, their faces smeared with grease and smoke, fighting a war against the planet itself. For 4 weeks, they hacked a canal through the floe. It was a scar on the face of the world, leading from the ship to the dark water on the horizon. They were exhausted. Their hearts fluttered in their chests, but they were close. The ship was ready to move. The boiler was lit. The steam pressure rose, and then the Antarctic laughed. On the verge of victory, the wind shifted. The pressure from the north returned. The crew stood on the deck and watched in disbelief as the invisible hand of the ocean squeezed the ice field. The canal they had spent a month carving simply vanished. The walls of the trench slid together. The water disappeared. The ice healed itself. In an hour, their escape route was erased. The ship was locked tight again. The silence that followed was heavier than the ice. The men dropped their tools. They did not weep. They were beyond tears. They sat on the deck, staring at the white wall that had defeated them. They accepted the end. They went back to their cabins to wait for the cold to take them. But the ocean is a capricious god. 2 weeks later, on the 15th of February, the ship woke them up. It was not a scream this time. It was a shudder. A deep, resonant vibration traveled through the keel. The men ran to the deck. The floor beneath them was moving. A long, ocean swell was rolling under the ice pack, lifting the floes and dropping them. The rigid prison was breathing. Suddenly, a crack appeared off the starboard bow. It ran like a lightning bolt across the snow. Then another, then another. The sound was deafening, a cacophony of thunder and grinding stones. The solid world was shattering. The Belgica groaned as the pressure released. The channel opened up, not where they had sawed, but where the ocean chose. The black water rushed in. The propeller churned. The steam engine roared. The ship lurched forward, bruising its wooden shoulders against the ice, clawing its way toward the gray horizon. They were battered. They were broken. But they were moving. When the Belgica finally limped into the harbor of Punta Arenas in March 1899, the people on the docks stopped cheering. They saw the ship first. It was no longer the proud, black bark that had left Europe with flags snapping in the wind. It was a wreck. The paint had been scoured away by the ice, leaving the hull gray and scarred. The rigging hung loose like the webs of a dead spider. But then they saw the faces of the men on the deck. They did not look like heroes. They looked like revenants. They were ghosts who had forgotten how to haunt. Their skin was leathery and weather-beaten, yet pallid underneath, like old parchment. Their eyes were sunk deep into their skulls. They squinted against the sunlight. They flinched at the sound of a dog barking or a church bell ringing. The world of men was too loud. It was too colorful. After a year in the monochrome prison of the ice, civilization felt like an assault. Adrien de Gerlache had achieved his dream. He was the commander of the first expedition to winter in the Antarctic. The newspapers called him a pioneer. Kings and geographic societies sent telegrams of praise. But when the cameras flashed, de Gerlache did not smile. He looked at his hands. He knew the truth. He had not conquered the ice. He had merely survived its mercy. The guilt of the prison he had built for his men would follow him for the rest of his life. He returned to Belgium a celebrated man, but inside, he was still drifting in the Bellingshausen Sea. For others, the ice never let go. Adam Tollefson, the sailor who had hidden in the darkness of the hold, stepped onto the dry land, but his mind remained in the polar night. He never recovered his sanity. He spent the rest of his days in an asylum, whispering about the things he had seen in the shadows. He was the tithe the expedition paid to the cold. But there was one man who walked off the gangplank with a different look in his eyes. Roald Amundsen was 27 years old. He was thin, he was battered, but he was not broken. To him, the horror of the last 13 months was not a tragedy. It was a classroom. While others had prayed for rescue, Amundsen had taken notes. He looked at the scurvy and learned that fresh blood was the only cure. He looked at the heavy wool coats of the Europeans and realized they were useless sponges. Only fur could stop the wind. He learned that in the Deadlands, morality is a luxury you cannot afford. To live, you must be willing to eat your sled dogs. You must be willing to be a savage. 14 years later, these lessons would decide the fate of the South Pole. The British explorer Robert Falcon Scott would march south with ponies and wool and noble intentions. He would die. Roald Amundsen would march south with dogs and furs and the ruthless efficiency he learned on the Belgica. He would plant his flag and return home. The difference between life and death was written in the logbook of the Belgica. The expedition faded into history. The men died. The ship was eventually scuttled and sank to the bottom of the sea, but the silence remains. The Antarctic is still there. It does not care about our flags or our ambitions. It waits. It is a mirror. When you strip away the sun and the warmth and the rules of society, you are left with only what is inside you. The Belgica proved that we can survive the darkness, but it also taught us that we do not come back from it unchanged. We leave a part of our humanity in the ice, frozen in the eternal white, waiting for the next fool to come looking for it.